Ready to bring your Warhammer armies to life with epic cavalry? In this quick tutorial, I'll show you a technique for painting horses that charge into battle with style and realism. From noble steeds to battle-worn war horses, this method works great for any horse miniatures from Warhammer, 40k, historical wargaming, or fantasy settings. Grab your brushes and let's saddle up. What's up, nerds? Welcome back to the painting desk. My name is Sam, and today we're painting some Grim Guard cavalry from Station Forge. I'm going to be using these for my Death Corps of Krieg army, and I'm going to proxy them for Rough Riders. So to start, I printed these models, and then I primed them black, and I set them up for slap chop. And if you're not familiar with that, that's basically where you just set them up with an undershade with a matte gray zenithal prime over black, and then you take a dry brush and a strong white. I used Pro Acryl in this case, and you give it a nice white dry brush all around. And then once you do that, we're ready to start painting. So the first horse I'm painting is a dark horse, like a black color or dark gray. And to do that, I'm going to be using contrast paint, Citadel, black Templar mixed with contrast medium. So I usually like to do a ratio of 2:1 medium to paint, and what this does is it'll just dial back the intensity of the contrast paint and it'll make it more transparent. And because we set up the model with all the undershading, those values will really show through since the contrast paint's a little bit more transparent. So I just go ahead and paint it over the horse's skin, and I avoid the mane and the tail and the hooves. And after that contrast layer has fully dried, you can see we already have a nice look here with some nice values from dark to light. But now we're going to take it a step further. So a lot of times when you see slap chop, if you don't know what that is, just Google it. There's a bunch of videos about slap chop. And it's a great way to make your minis look high quality with low effort. However, one side effect that I don't like about slap chop is the dry brush stage of the white often leaves a chalky, powdery, rough texture on the minis, and what this step does is that mitigates it. So what I do is I take the lightest color that I see and I try to find a paint that matches. In this case, Eshen Grey is pretty close, so I take Eshen Grey and I thin it out on my wet palette to a very thin consistency. Almost a glaze, but maybe just a little thicker than a glaze. And I just carefully go around the mini and I focus on all the raised areas where I see that grainy texture from the dry brush undershading, and I smooth it out with this Eshen Grey. You'll notice immediately that the blending looks so much better and cleaner. Depending on the colors that you're using, you might want to take this a step further. In this case I do with Mechanicus Standard Gray, and I thin it out to a very thin consistency, nearly glaze. And I do this process once again, but focusing on the most raised areas for a little bit of targeted highlights here and there. And then once I'm happy with the results there, I do the tail and the mane with just a coat of contrast paint, black Templar, right out of the pot. For white horses, we're doing a similar process, but we're using Apothecary White contrast paint. And then this is applied straight out of the pot all over the horse's skin, avoiding the tail and mane in case we want to color that different. And with one coat of the contrast paint, we already get a nice look here, but we still have that grainy texture. So once again, we'll be going over with a lighter gray. In this case, Administratum Grey. And I thin it out with some water on my wet palette to a nice glaze or a light layer consistency. And I just carefully go over the most raised areas where you see that lighter coloring and where you also see that grainy texture. And as you glaze over it, that grainy texture will just disappear. You'll get some really nice smooth transitions. And once that layering is dry, you could stop here, or you could take it a step further. In this case, I'm going to make it a little bit lighter using Ulthuan Grey, and just repeating the same process that it did before. However, this time I'm not going to go all the way to the edge that it did before with the Administratum Grey. However, I'm going to try to stay more towards the higher areas and blend it through. Now this particular paint is very strong in the pigment, so I really thinned it down and it shows a lot here as I'm applying it, but as it dries it'll darken up just a little bit and have a nicer blending look. So different paints behave differently when you thin them out, so always keep that in mind. And when that dries, you can see it's blended together nicely and we have a nice light colored horse. For chestnut horses, I'm going to use a contrast paint Gorgruntifer, which is a nice warm brown, but I'm going to thin it with some contrast medium. I'm using a 2-to-1 ratio. And if you haven't used contrast medium before, it's really great for dialing back the intensity of the contrast paints, because some of these come out really strong and you may just want to dial back the intensity a little bit so you have a little bit more control over the final appearance. And after that coat's applied, you can see we get some really nice transitions from light to dark, but once again we have that grainy texture from the dry brush undershade. So I'm going to be going over that with Scrag Brown. And once again we will be applying a very, very thin layer consistency here. If it comes out a little too thin, you can always go over with a second pass. It'd be better to have it thinner than too thick, as the thinner it is, the more transparent the paint is, and then the smoother the blending. And when that's all done, we have a nice chestnut colored horse. And the coloring looks good, so I don't think it needs any more lighter passes with some different paint. So now for the mane and the tail, I just go over that with Wyldwood contrast paint right out of the pot. For the brown horse, we're going to follow a similar pattern as we did for the chestnut, but instead of Gorgruntifer, I'm just going to be using Wyldwood. Also thinning this out with the contrast medium, a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts medium to 1 part paint. And we go around and apply this all over the horse's skin until we get a full coat coverage. And then once that dries, we kind of take a look at the lightest color. And in this case, Steel Legion Drab is a good match. So I apply a layering of Steel Legion Drab over all the raised areas to eliminate that scratchy dry brush texture and to blend the transitions from light to dark really smoothly. And in this case, with the chestnut horse as well as this one, this is the step where I stopped. I did not pull out any other brown paint to go lighter. Blonde horses, we follow a similar pattern once again, but in this case I'm using Skeleton Horde contrast paint, applying that directly from the pot all over the miniature until we get a nice coat. In this case, I think I ended up doing 2 coats of contrast paint just to get a nice rich blonde undertone. And much like before, we go over this with a layer. In this case I'm using Talaran Sand, which is a nice warm blondish brown. And I start building up those highlights all around the miniature. And after that dries, we have some nice highlights in the raised areas, and then I want to take this a step further where I pull out the Karak Stone to try to make the horse a little bit more lighter, kind of like a darker, dirty blonde. One way you can control the contrast between light and dark is by changing the way you shade it, using a darker undershade or a lighter undershade. In the case of the lighter, you just simply apply more gray paint and a more intense white dry brush to lighten up the miniature overall. To add more variation to your horses, you can add some shading on the lower legs. In this case, I shaded this commander's legs with Agrax Earthshade on his horse, just to make it stand out from the others. So now that I've gone through my process, let's take a look at all these one last time. Well, there you have it, an undershading approach to painting horses. Well, I hope you found this video helpful, useful, entertaining, interesting, all that good stuff. And if you did like it, leave me a thumbs up. And also, if any questions or comments, let me know in the comment section below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!